Hello and welcome to the International Literature Festival Dublin, brought to you by Dublin City Council with kind support from the Arts Council. Please take a moment to silence your mobile and take note of your nearest emergency exit. Thank you and enjoy.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you in person and online to the 30th Dublin Literary Award Winner in Conversation event here in Merrion Square Park at the International Literature Festival Dublin. Yesterday, The Adversary by Canadian author Michael Crummy was announced as the Dublin Literary Award winner from a long list of 71 titles from libraries in 34 countries and chosen from a very strong shortlist of 6 novels. Michael Crummy received the most valuable prize in the world for a single work of fiction in English from the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Emma Blaine, the patron of the award, which is sponsored by Dublin City Council. The prize awards excellence in world literature. Once again, thanks to our international judges, Professor Leonard Casuto, Nidizak Ariaib, Fiona Z. Gerbrand Bacher, Martina Devlin, and non-voting chair, Professor Chris Marash, the Seamus Heaney Professor of Irish Writing. We will now hear from the winner of this year's Dublin Literary Award, Michael Crummy, for The Adversary, published by Knopf Canada. The winner will be joined by Madeleine Keane, literary editor for the Sunday Independent, writer, travel journalist, and chair of Children's Books Ireland. So please put your hands together now and welcome Michael Crummy, winner of the 30th Dublin Literary Award, to the stage.
Actually, I think you're that side.
I'm still being told where to go.
That's the way of it in Dublin. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Speranza. Michael Crummy is the author of 7 books of poetry and a collection of short stories, Flesh and Blood. His first 2 novels, River Thieves and The Wreckage, among various nominations and awards, were both long-listed for the Dublin Literary Award, while his third, Galore, was shortlisted for the award. His books have won innumerable prizes and plaudits, and he is a best-selling author in his native Canada, and further afield after this week, I would imagine. His novels Sweetland and The Innocents were followed by The Adversary, yesterday announced as the winner of the 2025 Dublin Literary Award. Please give him a very warm Irish welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Before the shortlist was made public, I read that you said you thought, this maybe could be my year. And then you saw the shortlist and you said, maybe not. I want you to relive the moment when you got the call to pack your bags for Dublin and that you had one.
It was. By that point, I had assumed that the winner had heard weeks before. So honestly, I had stopped thinking about it. And I had dropped my wife, who was at sea at the moment. She's a wildlife biologist. She's somewhere in the Labrador Sea on a 5-week research trip. I dropped her at the airport so she could get off on that trip. And then I was packing my bags to go to Quebec. I was flying out right after her. And the phone rang, and I didn't recognize the number. So I almost didn't pick it up because I was in a rush. But I did answer the phone, and it was my editor, one of my Marthas,
Yes.
Martha Canyon-Forstner, my longtime editor and the publisher at Knopf. And I knew when I heard her voice why she was calling, but I could not believe that was possible. And then after we spoke, I had to get in the car and drive to the airport. I should not have been driving. And my wife's plane, and of course I had to keep the secret for a month. And my wife's plane had been delayed long enough that I got to see her at the departure gate. And so we had our little moment there, and then she went off to board her plane, and I walked about 10 feet, and I ran into somebody I grew up with who said, "Did you win or what? Did you win?" And I thought, there's no way I'm going to be able to keep a secret in this town. Like, it's just not possible. So I've been lying through my teeth for a month, and it's such a relief to be able to say it to people.
Shall we get the vulgar question out of the way?
Sure.
The money. What are you going to do with it? And by the way, I love that, okay, it's 100,000 euro. That translates apparently into 154,000 Canadian dollars, which sounds really fabulous. I mean, I know it's the same amount, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's pretty fabulous. You know, I don't want to overstate this, but like good news in the life of a writer is a rare and wondrous thing. And good news of this sort is so far beyond good news that I keep thinking that this is a really elaborate practical joke, and that at the end of this event, someone will say, "Oh, we gotcha, we gotcha." So if the money actually comes through, I've tried not to spend it in my head.
I've almost spent it for you vicariously, actually.
I'm hoping, I have never been able to do this, but I'll be giving a little bit of money to our daughters. My mom has mom's 85. She spent Christmas in Hawaii, and she rides motorbike with my brothers, and she has a travel fund, so I'll make a little donation to her travel fund. I have a surprise for my wife's birthday, which is in the middle of June. And beyond that, I have always wanted a little wood-fired sauna. I used to spend some time in Northern Ontario where there are a lot of Finns. And they all had these wood-fired cedar saunas. And it was, and the one that I used was right on a lake. And so you'd come out of the sauna and into the lake. And it's the closest thing I've ever come to having a religious experience. So I've always wanted something like that, and it was just never something I could consider. So now I'm considering it.
I love it.
Yeah. And it will also just make it possible for me to keep writing.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
The freedom, you know, takes that monkey off your back.
For a while, yeah. Well, I mean, I quit my job, my day job, when I sold my first novel. And Martha Kenyon Forstner, she was my editor on that book. And they bought it for what seemed to me at the time like an astonishing amount of money. So I quit my day job. And when I look back at that now, I think, what were you thinking? Yeah. But that always felt like a temporary thing. Like I always assumed at some point I was going to have to go to the corner store and ask if they were hiring. But I am sneaking up on retirement age. So winning this at this point in my life thinks I might make it without actually having to do a 9-to-5 again.
Well, it's lucky us is all I can say, because The Adversary is a marvellous book. The great thing about this award is, I will totally confess, I'd never heard of you.
Yep.
But so many people will have heard of you now. And I got to the end of the book, and I was talking to a friend of mine, and I said, you know that feeling when you get to the end of a book? And she said, yeah, you just want to start it again. It's so fabulous. I said, that, and I want to read everything else he's ever written. Which brings me to The Innocents, which was your book before this.
Yep.
And in a way, The Adversary has its genesis in that book.
Yeah.
Would you like to talk to that?
Sure, yeah. It's really hard to talk about this book without talking about The Innocents, which is odd because you don't need to know anything about The Innocents. It's not a sequel.
This is a standalone.
It's a standalone, but they are companion books in my head. So The Innocents, when I wrote that book, it was just, as far as I was concerned, that was it. And it's a novel that's based on a true story. I found a little note in the Newfoundland and Labrador archives. And it was a note by, or I can't even remember, by or about a clergyman who was traveling around Newfoundland. And this was way back in the early years of European settlement in Newfoundland. Most communities were too small to have a church, so the clergy traveled. And in the course of his travels, he happened upon an orphan brother and sister living in a tiny cove on their own, quickly sussed out that the girl was pregnant, automatically assumed, and I'm sure he was quite right about this, that the brother was the father. And being a clergyman, of course, he got on his horse and came aboard of him. and the brother ended up driving him out of the cove with a rifle. That was it, one paragraph. And my first thought was, oh, now that's a story. And my second thought was, I am not touching that with a 10-foot pole. No, I did not want to write that book at all. So I didn't make note of it. I didn't write anything down. I couldn't find that paragraph again if my life depended on it. But I was haunted by those children. And I imagined that they had been orphaned before the changes that led to adolescence and then adulthood happened. So not only would they not have anyone to ask about what the hell is going on with me, they wouldn't even have had the language to ask those questions. That they would have been completely innocent of that world. And I wanted to write a book that did the exact opposite of what the clergyman did. I wanted to write a book that allowed for those things to happen between them and for them to retain their dignity somehow. It was called a lot of things before it was called The Innocents, and they kept being rejected for one reason or another, and we were reaching the point where we needed a title. And my wife was the one who said, you know, I keep thinking of the whole notion of innocence when I think about those children. And I think that's the title, The Innocents. And simply for that reason, I mean, it's a complete fluke, but simply for that reason, I started thinking a lot about Blake's Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. And those two lyric sequences, you know, the first about the innocence of childhood and the beauty of nature and the mercy of God and all of those beautiful things. And then the second flips that on its head completely. And he wanted to show the two contrary natures of the human soul. So there's still lambs, as there are lambs in the Songs of Innocence, but they're being taken to the slaughterhouse. There's still children, but instead of playing in the fields, they're begging on the streets. And instead of the beauty and mercy of God and nature, it's about the corruption of the church as it existed at the time. And I started to think, could I do that with a novel? Could I do a novel that's a mirror image? And I had, when I was researching The Innocents, I came across this guy who I really wanted to put in The Innocents, but he was too big, and I just left him out. And I thought, you know, if I did flip this on the script, this would be my guy. It was a merchant who lived in Bonavista, Newfoundland, in the late 1700s, and he was, his name was George Ryder, complete reprobate, like drunkard, bully, braggart. He shot and killed an Irish servant during an argument. There were no consequences for that murder other than being named Justice of the Peace for the Bonavista area.
The way you do, yeah.
After he became Justice of the Peace, he went to St. John's and recruited a group of prostitutes and set up his own brothel in Bonavista, and everybody there hated him. And they signed petitions and wrote letters to the governor, and they could not get rid of this guy. And I thought that would be my man. But there was no story. I thought, okay, he is an arsehole, like from top to bottom.
And that's putting it mildly.
But to put it mildly, but what is the story? So I was stuck until I realized if this is a mirror image, then there has to be a sister. And as soon as that came into my head, it's almost like the book started writing itself. And so The Innocents is kind of a twisted Adam and Eve story, and this is a Cain and Abel story. And love is the engine in the Innocents, and in this book it's greed and avarice and hatred. So it's a beach read, really. It's a summer book.
Light and fluffy. And the brother and sister are brilliantly called, because if that's Adam and Eve, the characters, the two siblings in this, are Abe and the widow Cain's. So Cain and Abel.
I'm not really subtle all the time. So the brother and sister in The Innocents are Ada and Everett. So, yeah.
Will you read a little bit?
I'd love to, yeah. And I'm not going to read anything about the brother and sister.
Okay.
One of the challenges in writing a book about characters like these two, who are, I would say, narcissistic sociopaths. One is equally as bad as the other. The difficulty for a writer is that they do not change. They're exactly the same on the first page as they are on the last page. So for me, the novel was about all of the people around them. What happens in a circumstance where the power in a community is a black hole? Like the locus is basically a black hole, and you are going to be sucked into the orbit of one or the other. How do we make decisions about where we go? And so for me, writing the book was all about the characters around the brother and the sister. And there are a couple of children, youngsters, who were the only, for me, source of light in the book. And I had to force myself not to protect them. I made a decision when I started writing the book that I was not going to interfere. If I was going to set up this circumstance, I was never going to step in to protect somebody because I didn't want something awful to happen to them. There's a brother and sister, Bride and Solemn, whose father was murdered by Abe early on in the book. And there's also a young fellow who has been renamed since his arrival, Lazarus. And he grew up as a thief on the Thames in England and had gone to prison, and he'd been branded with a T. And he got out of being sent to Australia by agreeing to go to work for someone in Newfoundland. So I think that's all you need to know for that. In the space of a month, Lazarus was disowned by the underworld and abandoned to an honest life. His former mates shunned him on the waterfront, feeling if they couldn't risk touching him, they could at least act as if he were dead, which was right and proper in the boy's mind. He wanted to be a new creature in the world, a stranger to all he'd known. Everything about his past filled him with remorse, and he renounced it all in his heart, keeping himself as far clear of the convicts as he could manage. The one mark of his old self he felt chained to was the letter, the unalterable brand proclaiming his days of venality and transgression. That badge preceded him each time he extended his hand at Sunday meetings of the Quakers. It was like a letter of reprimand sent ahead of a sailor's every port of call, counseling mistrust and caution. Mrs. Lamb was mostly insensible to the world around her, but even she happened upon it as she sat beside him, running her fingers absently over the back of the youngster's hand. When it struck her, she was tracing a raised figure there. She glanced down to take in the mark, tracing it again. Whatever does this mean, Lazarus? She asked. He shook his head. Nothing you need worry about, he said, standing from the bunk and announcing it was time he got home. Solemn followed him outside, and Lazarus was in tears when he came up to him. He lifted his face to the sky, to the first stars coming clear in the dark. I wish I could cut the bloody thing off, he said. He was a beautiful creature, Solemn thought. Delicate-featured, the marks on his skin like pale moths on the glass of a lamp. He knew next to nothing of Laz's old life, but he'd heard stories of Matterface and Heater taking the boy to the edge of Strap's property and having their way with him. Solemn couldn't picture what that meant exactly, though it stirred a helpless anger in him, a sick sort of jealousy to be excluded by the boy's experience of the world, by his pain. He took Laz's hand in his own and traced the letter as his mother had, thinking of the red-hot iron the beetle used to seal the stump of Imogen's arm after the amputation. What if we didn't have to cut it off, he asked. What else is there to do? It might be, Solemn said. We could erase it or bury it, like, if you're willing to suffer some. Laz wiped at his face with his shirt sleeve. I feel like I was born to that, he said. The following Sunday, they built a fire in the clearing behind the back wall of their tilt, where the household's wood was sawed and junked, and Solemn set an iron poker among the coals. He'd smuggled half a bottle of rum from the widow's house during the previous week, and he handed it to Lazarus as they waited for the iron to kindle. But the youngster set it aside. I can do everything through him who gives me strength, he said. He knelt beside the wood horse, and Solemn lashed his arm to the frame's top rail. Bride sat astride the horse to weight it to the ground as she watched Solemn take the iron from the fire, the tip glowing molten like an angel with news for the fallen world. "Do your worst," Lazarus said, and he set a leather bit between his teeth. Bride circled her arms around his neck and buried her face in the boy's hair, and she held on as he rocked and shifted and grunted helplessly. The stink of burnt flesh struck her then, and she lifted her head to see Solemn standing with the poker raised in the air, looking like he had cast a devilish spell and terrified to see it made manifest in the world. They untied the boy's arm and plunged his hand into a bucket of seawater they put by. Solemn and Bride kneeling beside Lazarus to stroke his head and hold him as he wrestled with the vulgar shock of it. They were all crying in that tight clutch, amazed by the savagery of the moment, the wonder of it. They stayed like that until the worst of Lazarus' shaking had passed. He spit the soggy leather from his mouth and raised his head to gulp in the air as if he'd just surfaced from the ocean floor. He said, I might try a drop of that stuff now. Bride uncorked the bottle and he held it to his lips and he nodded against the liquid burn. Solemn took it from her and swallowed a mouthful, trembling himself to have offered that terrible cleansing upon his friend. Lazarus raised his hand from the bucket and turned it in the light to see what had become of the brand. The letters showed black beneath the raw marks scored into the flesh. That will look like nothing but noise once the scars set, Solemn said. Bride took Lazarus's face in her hands. What is old has passed away, she said. He plunged the acid sear back into the bucket and sucked air through his teeth. Amen to that, he whispered.
Thank you very much. I should have said at the outset that I will allow about 10 minutes at the end for questions from the audience, and Michael will be signing books as well. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty. You said in an interview, thinking about this book, you thought of, when the worst of human beings are in power, what happens? And you decided that what you were going to do was take the worst of the world as we have made it and compress it down and play it out in this tiny community in Newfoundland 200 years ago. And so one of the main characters is Abe, this greedy, venal, lying, stupid, narcissistic sociopath.
But entertaining.
But are there any contemporary relevances to that?
I think some people have drawn some connections to the modern world.
You don't say.
I don't know if I would have drawn Abe in the way I had if I didn't have George Ryder to point to. And he was my model, but he just seemed so bang on to what we have seen in the United States of America in the last while, that it's inevitable that people are going to draw that conclusion. And the one thing that I think I took from the current president of the United States that George Ryder didn't have, there's no indication that George Ryder was a coward of any sort, whereas Abe Strapp is said to be the biggest coward that ever shat a turd. And to me, that is something that the president has that Mr. Ryder does not. So that was the one direct thing that I took from him and added to Abe's repertoire.
And I didn't realize the first time I read it that, in fact, it was only when I did my research that Abe was based on this. There was a person who was that bad. And what your writing is so good that while he's a despicable character, it's like, when someone is, they nervously laugh in an uncomfortable situation. It's like he's almost comic, and yet, and like a car crash, you can't look away. He's compelling in his awfulness.
Yes, and I have to admit, it's a weird thing to write a book like this and to take pleasure in it. There's a certain, what was it Keats said about Shakespeare, that he had the negative capability. So he was able to inhabit the best of humanity and the worst. So he took as much pleasure in creating Iago as he did creating Juliet, for example. And there is a certain writerly pleasure in being able to put him on the page and to make him as awful as he is. And to put him in circumstances where you can see why, despite the fact that he is such a miserable human being, people might gather around him and look to him as somebody that they can ride into positions of power themselves.
Yeah, and then, of course, you have his sister, who actually, while he's fascinating, she is the really, I see her as the central character. Now, one of the judges said to me yesterday, oh, yes, she's Medea, isn't she? But she's not, no one is as bad as her brother, but there's, she's transactional in her way of the world, but she's good to the children, ish.
Yeah, I mean, my first readers, and it's been the same for years now, are my wife and the Marthas, my agent and my editor. And they both said after reading that first draft that they were pulling for the widow. And I thought, well, I've made a huge mistake. I have not done my job. And in a way, it's inevitable because she is. It's like the Cain and Abel story. Abel's sacrifice is accepted and Cain's is not. We're never told why. It's just that's the way it is. In the world that these people live in, Abe's sacrifice, such as it is accepted. He's a man, so he's been given the family business. And the widow, simply because she's a woman, is cut out. And it's inevitable that we, as readers in this world, will look at that and see that she's being treated unfairly and automatically feel sympathy for her. So I had to work really hard to try to make it clear that despite the fact that she's much smarter than her brother, that she has more guts, that she is able to work against a system that is, by definition, unfair to her. Despite all of those things, she is, in fact, no better than her brother. That Abe is all appetite and she is all will, and that for each of them, they are completely transactional. Although they're chalk and cheese in how they see the world and how they operate. They don't see the outside world as having any relevance outside of what of it they can own and control. And the widow's real gift is her ability to give people the impression that she has their best interests at heart, as she does with the children. But she never has anyone's interests at heart but her own. The reason she takes Solomon under her wing is because she knows the fact that Abe has killed his father means that he could be useful to her. And in her way, I think she's actually more frightening than Abe. Abe is so obvious that you can see him coming from a mile away. The widow is much more likely. It's the only people who see through the widow are a couple of women in the book.
Yes,
yeah.
But if you think about the fate of so many of the women in the book, you kind of can see her point in a way, the widow Kane's. It is her gender that she's so constrained by, and women are chattels and vessels and just to be appallingly mistreated all the time.
True, but I don't think that is the reason that she's a narcissistic sociopath. I think that she was that, and the world presented her with particular challenges because of her gender.
Yeah.
But one of the things I talk about in the novel is her habit as a young girl of collecting animals to draw, collecting Spanish tickles and frogs and birds and baby birds and things like that. But she never names them. When she's done with them, she feeds them to the hunting dogs. It's a proprietorial relationship she has with them. That's something that is in her from the beginning. and it's something that only gets worse as she gets older. So, you know, the point where things become very difficult for her, she has these birds in a cage that she takes out one at a time and breaks their necks and throws them into the fire. Those are the two, that's the brother and sister. She has the same relationship to those birds in the cage as she does to those children. So, so my feeling, and I know some people feel differently about this, but my feeling is that when we see her in that first scene where she's sabotaging Abe's wedding with a lie, and then throws that poor young girl into Abe's arms, she has no feeling for anybody there but her sense of, what can I do to this guy? How do I get at him? Or as Mr. Trump might say, how do I fuck with this person? Yeah. Right? And that's Trump's only real skill, is that he is quite good at fucking with people. And it's without compunction, without regret, and without mercy. That's the only thing he has. And I think both of these people have that in equal measure.
I was interested, and you said it earlier about, you know, not wanting to interfere with your characters, that while you might have wanted to protect the children, you were going to let it play out. And I'm really interested in that as a writer, and how these characters do their thing, don't they? You know.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I've always wanted to do, and I think I tried to do in The Innocents, like my deliberate reason for writing that book was to, at the end of the book, I loved those children, and I wanted a reader to love them as well. And I wanted them to come to that moment in their lives as fully human, dignified people. And nobody would ever accuse me of writing light books. But I've always wanted to write books in which I'm looking for what's good in people. Even in the darkest of stories, I'm looking for those moments where the best of who we are against all odds shows its face. Even if it's no help, seeing that, I think, can give us hope.
Yes, that's what's very moving. I mean, although it is, you know, there is darkness and depravity and corruption and real cruelty, and yet that refrain, we are the children of the light, there is hope and there is light. And that was one of the things that I found so intensely moving about it.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to hear that you saw that there. Not everybody does, and I'm not even sure I intended that, but. You know, I'm willing to accept that once a book is out of my hands, I don't own it.
Well, you see, that's it. A book is only a book once the reader meets the writer.
That's right.
That's the communion of it, isn't it?
For sure. And in some ways, there's a real freedom for me, because once you realize that what a reader's response to a book often says as much about the reader as it does about the book. So it makes it a little bit easier to deal with people who hate your books.
Eric Vollmer's reviewing the adversary for the Calgary Herald wrote, in the first 100 pages, there's a forced marriage, spousal abuse, a drowning, a stillbirth, a scolding, an amputation, and a cold-blooded murder. And yet there's so much more to follow. And you know, I know you say you don't like to interfere with your characters, but controlling that narrative, there's an awful lot going on.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so there are a couple of things going on there. One is that I was trying to describe honestly how difficult that world was. Newfoundland in the 17th and 18th century was an unbelievably difficult place to make a go of it. There was almost nothing you had control over. There was very little in the way of medical care. There was almost no education. And the fishery was very unpredictable, and the weather was Old Testament biblically bad.
I see the weather as the adversary, or certainly one of them.
The place is one of the adversaries in this book. Yes, there's no question about that. I've always said that Newfoundlanders are famous for their attachment to the place they were born and raised. And there's an old joke about Newfoundlanders that they'll be the only unhappy people in heaven because they'll all be wanting to go back to the island. But I've always said, that love is not requited. Like, the place does not return it.
It's so harsh.
It's so harsh. And that's less and less true, of course, because modern technology makes it possible to deal with the unpredictability and the harshness of it. But everybody in those communities lived on a knife's edge. And when things went wrong, they went badly wrong and very quickly. So that is part of it. But I felt like the innocence was kind of a fable. And in some ways, this is as well. The adversary in the Bible is Satan. That's how he's referred to in a number of cases. And I wanted to create a world and a landscape where it felt like the adversary was at large, where whatever corner you turned, that thing, that person, that whatever that adversary is, you might find that thing face to face. So a lot of the physical horror that is in this book was an attempt to create that sense of how close the adversary was to all of these people at all times.
And just because, why not throw in a pandemic as well?
Well, now that's an interesting thing.
There's another adversary.
Yeah, so the innocence starts at the same time as the adversary. And they cover the exact same period of time. So the innocence takes place in a tiny cove near this town called Mockbeggar. And we never leave the cove, but we hear about Mockbeggar. And occasionally people show up from Mockbeggar. The adversary takes place in Mockbeggar. And we never see those children. They're mentioned once or twice, but it covers the same period of time. So I've laid this story on top of that one. When I was writing The Innocents, I was just throwing stuff in there because the first thing I had to do was orphan those children. So I thought, okay, a sickness comes upon the shore, the parents die. And then later on in the book, it's two children alone in a cove, so I had to add things that I thought would bring some drama to the story. So some sailors show up on their way somewhere. A couple of other strays come through. A huge storm comes in. I think that would be interesting. And then the sickness comes back into the cove. All of that was just where it felt like I needed it in the story to make the story work. When I started writing this story, I had to write a story where all of these things happened at a particular time. The Innocents was written before the pandemic. So the fact that there's a pandemic in this book is completely by accident. That's purely happenstance. But I did feel like I had a particular experience of the world that allowed me to talk about what is it like in a community where people are locked down because it's dangerous to go outside. And how do people respond to that? How do people in positions of power, how do people who are going to lose money because of this lockdown respond to that sort of thing? But again, it was simply because I had no choice but to put that in there because of the previous novel.
And, that brings me to the whole, notion of appropriation. And I read your Kreisel lecture of 2019, Most of What Follows is True. And, in it, you ask the question and answer, what do I owe to the history and the historical figures I write about? Are there limits to the liberties I can take? So, talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, this was a lecture that I wrote in response to the whole question of who owns stories. Yeah. And this is a big thing in Canada, particularly around Indigenous stories. Up until very recently, the story of the people who lived in those landscapes before Europeans arrived has been told by the Europeans who settled there. And there's a big movement among the indigenous communities to say those stories belong to us, and we should be allowed to tell them. And our story of what happened is very different than yours. In Newfoundland, we have a smaller experience of that, where it's been a primarily oral culture right up until my mom and dad's generation. But there have been a number of what we call come-from-aways, people from the mainland who come to Newfoundland to fish or to canoe or whatever, and they stay a few months, and then they write a book about Newfoundland, and it wins the Pulitzer Prize and sells a zillion copies. And some Newfoundlanders are like, that is not your story. Like, we haven't had the chance to tell it yet, and you're getting it wrong. And so I think that there's a real question about where, and on top of that is the question of, if you're writing about the past and about real people from the past, do you have the right to put them in a book and say, this is what they thought, this is what they said to this person at this time? And I think those are really thorny questions without any clear answers. You know, I think there is a line where you can do that with respect, and that will enlarge a reader's sense of what that world might have been like. And then on the other side of that, there's something that's really exploitative, and that will obscure a person's understanding of that world. There's a book which I talk about in that lecture, called The Lightkeeper? No, something like that. It's an American novel set in Newfoundland. It has no resemblance to Newfoundland whatsoever, like none.
It's very funny.
Except for place names. It's like he did no work at all to have any sense of who those people were and why they were there. And I was traveling through at literary festivals in the U.S., and when people found out I was from Newfoundland, they would say, oh, I've read this book. I know lots about Newfoundland. I was like, you don't know a thing about Newfoundland. Everything you think about, about Newfoundland is not true. So clearly there's a line. That book is on that side of the line. But everybody's line will be placed somewhere different. Yeah. And you just have to make your own decisions about where you think that line is. Like when I wrote my first novel, River Thieves, and I've never done this since, I used a lot of historical characters, people you can find in the history books. And I made things up. I made up we knew what they did, but we don't know why they did those things. We don't know what they were thinking. We don't know what their motivations were. I made that up. And I was so uncomfortable with that process that I put a scene in where one of the main characters talks about an experience he had where he and his father found the Beothuk were the indigenous people in Newfoundland who no longer exist as a cultural group at all because of the arrival of Europeans. And they find a Beothuk grave, and the father picks up the skull and does this miming with it and does a Beothuk voice, which imagine something less respectful. And his family had been very involved in a lot of the violence. And he realizes at a certain point, because of what they were involved in, at some point 200 years in the future, some stranger could pick his bones up out of the grave and put their own words in his mouth in the same way. And that was me he was talking about, right? I was the stranger doing that in this book. And I don't think I could have written that, or I couldn't have published that novel if that scene wasn't in there, to give him a chance, to give that John Payton a chance to say, you may think this is me. You may think these are the things I thought, but that is not me. That's this crummy guy sitting in his underwear in an apartment in Kingston, Ontario, right? I'm making that up. And I think we have to find ways to acknowledge that distance between fiction and reality.
And of course, that's what's so interesting about historical fiction particularly. And I mean, maybe it's the older I get, the more I love reading historical fiction. And the best of it is where the author has researched the hell out of this, but they wear it lightly.
Right.
You know, and it's clear that you did. And I was very interested in your acknowledgements. Michael is a poet, so there's the most lyrical use of language, but he has researched all this, the abusive terms, and it's so brilliant. So there's a fantastic range. I'm going to have the most brilliant range of insults now to give people. Cork-brained calf lollies, noddy peak simpletons, turdy guts, and my favourite, dirty shag bags. Did you have great fun doing that?
I had so much fun doing that. And I do think that people have often asked me about the difference between the darkness of the material and in some ways, the beauty of the language and the playfulness of the language. And I was hoping, and this was true for me as a writer, I was hoping that the language would be a refuge for readers. Like the language would be a place that readers could get some relief from the darkness of the material.
Yes, because it does bring a comic lightness to what is, dark material. And also, I mean,
I was writing about when I was writing about those storms that come through and the rage of the ocean, for example. There is a real beauty in those things, a terrible beauty, as Blake would say. And I really wanted to communicate that. But one of the books that I have had on my desk for everything I've ever written is the Dictionary of Newfoundland English. And it's one of my desert island books. It's an incredible work of scholarship. It's about 600 or 700 pages long. And it just, it includes all of the ways that the Europeans who became Newfoundlanders adapted and added to the English language to fit the world that they lived in. Just unbelievably creative, unbelievably joyful in its way. But I realized when I was writing The Innocents and The Adversary that they're set so far back in Newfoundland's European history that most of the characters would be European, not Newfoundlanders. So I went looking for something like that dictionary for Europeans. And I found, and as I always say, God bless the internet, I found a dictionary of the vulgar tongue. And vulgar just meant common at the time. So it was the language people spoke on the streets and in the bars and in the brothels. And but there was plenty of vulgarity in there. And I just pillaged that thing. Like whenever I had 2 or 3 people having a conversation that had any kind of edge to it, I went back to that dictionary over and over and over again. And there's one scene in the book where after Abe has brought the prostitutes back to his hometown, set them up in his childhood home, which is going to be the brothel, and the madam is asking, well, how many bedrooms are upstairs? And he says, well, there are 3 upstairs, and there's also the servants' room at the back by the kitchen. And she says, oh, the servants' room, that's seen its share of of click it, I imagine. He doesn't know what it means. So she tries something else. And then she goes through this whole list of words that they have for describing the act.
And can I do it?
Yes, yeah.
The servants' room, yes. It has seen its share of the good old trade of basket making, no doubt. Abe stared blankly. The blanket hornpipe, she said. The goat's jig. Click it. Making feet for children's stockings. And these were apparently...
That was how people talked about having sex. And the only reason that scene is in there was because I wanted to list all of those ways of... It just seems so... I was so entertained by how people spoke. And I do think that was in Newfoundland. That was absolutely true. And I think for people who did not have a formal education, how they spoke to one another was their way of understanding the world, but also entertaining themselves, you know? And you can see that in how people spoke, especially if they were upset with one another.
Yes.
Yeah.
You have great fun. Before I open it to the audience, you at the end of the book in the acknowledgements, you ask, a hallelujah for your agents and your editors. Can we have a hallelujah for libraries?
Absolutely. As I've said over and over since I've been here, I love libraries. And I grew up in a tiny mining town of about 1,500 people. and it was down 70 kilometers of a dead-end road, and there was nowhere at the end of that dead-end road, even then, that I think there was a bookstore when I was growing up. So libraries where books were. And I can still place myself on Saturday mornings in that room, just wandering around, taking books off the shelves at random and reading. And just the sense of possibility that library was. As a kid, it seemed massive to me. And I still feel that way when I walk into a library, that sense of awe and possibility. This book was nominated by the Newfoundland and Labrador Public Libraries for this award. And being here and winning an award that was established by and is run by librarians, it feels like a full circle moment. So the money is very nice, but the association of libraries with this, it just makes me incredibly grateful to be here and to be part of this.
And as are we to that little boy in that library all those years ago.
Yeah.
Let's let you have your say. Are there questions for Michael? I don't know, has anyone read the book or any questions? Now, once the first, there's some hands. Are there some hands going up? Did I see one? Yeah, there's a lady oh yeah.
Hi.
I don't think this is...
Yeah, it's on now.
Okay, great, sorry. I meant to ask because I think it's kind of funny how Canadian literature can be a little separate from other Anglophone literature. The only author that I'm really familiar with is Alice Munro, and I kind of was wondering, for someone unfamiliar with Canadian literature, what would you say? Here's where you should start.
Right. Wow. Boy, I mean, if you had asked me that 20 years ago, I think it would have been a much easier question to answer, because it does feel like in the last 20, 25 years, there's been an explosion of just phenomenal writers. And it's almost inappropriate to say Canadian literature now, because it's more like Canadian literatures. You know, there's an unbelievable number of Indigenous writers. And I'm not going to remember names, so I'm not going to try and name them, but that is one of the major branches now of Canadian literature in the last 20 years. There's Western Canadian writers, there's Quebec and Quebecois writers. Newfoundland in the last 20 or 30 years. One of our most famous writers, Bernice Morgan, when she quit her job at about 55. She had a novel in her head. She spent 3 or 4 years writing it. And when she found a big agent, and he said, I'm going to try and sell this for you, but I don't think I'm going to get a Toronto publisher, because no one outside of Newfoundland wants to read a book about Newfoundland, right? And then the shipping news happened. And then all of a sudden, there were publishers and agents flying into Newfoundland and beating the bushes, looking. And luckily, there were a bunch of writers there. So people like Lisa Moore and Wayne Johnson and Michael Winter and Kathleen Winter and on and on and on. Like, there is a Newfoundland literature now. But if names that, like Alice Munro, who have an international stature, I mean, Michael Ondaatje, to me, is a huge person to be looking at. Mavis Gallant, I think, is probably the best writer Canada has ever produced, but she only wrote short stories, which means that she did not get the same kind of attention. Rohinton Mystery. I could go on and on. So who's that?
Atwood.
Atwood, of course. I mean, there is no bigger writer in the world in terms of impact, I think. Partly because of what's happening in the world right now. She seems so prophetic. That's a start. But
some great suggestions.
Yes,
there.
yeah.
Is there a question at the back, is it?
So you said when you wrote your first novel that you were in your underwear in Kingston, Ontario.
Yeah.
Did you...
In a garret, in an attic.
And obviously all your novels are about Newfoundland. Did you have to leave home to realise that home was where you wanted to write about?
No. I left Newfoundland when I was about 21, and that was just circumstance. I'd started writing in my first year of university. I was one of those kids that had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And I went to university because my parents, who did not go, they insisted. And I took general courses, including English, and we did all poetry in that first term. And I don't know why, but I decided that's what I was going to do. But you couldn't tell anybody that. Like, that was very suspect. And also, like, I was a kid from Buckins. Like, who the hell did I think I was? So I wrote in secret for a long time, but I did an English degree as a way of feeling connected to the whole idea of writing. When I finished my degree, there was nothing I could do in terms of work, so I just applied to graduate schools and ended up getting into Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. And when I got there, I was there for almost 13 years. The only thing I wrote about was Newfoundland. People often ask me if I would consider writing a book not set in Newfoundland. And my answer is, I could, but why would I bother? Like, Newfoundland has been the greatest gift to me as a writer. It's like there are so many stories there that I will never live long enough to come close to exhausting it. And it's the place that made me, so it's the place that it's the only place I'm really interested in writing about. I will say, though, that I moved home about 25 years ago, and being there means that the books that I'm writing now about the place are much more genuine, I think. Because just walking around, I'm sure it's much like being here in Ireland, just walking around and listening to people talk is, I'm just constantly saying to people, can I use that? Do you mind if I put that in? And that just wouldn't have happened if I wasn't there. So I know that people like Joyce, a Newfoundland writer like Wayne Johnson, say they couldn't be here and write about the place, but that's not my experience at all. And I'm very happy to be home and writing about home while I'm there.
Is there, yes, another question on this side? And would you mind standing up when you ask the question, please? A little dystopian message came on the screen. Ask them to stand up.
Hi, I'd like to thank Dublin City Council for this terrific festival, for which they're to be applauded, and I'd like to thank you for a superb interview. I'm interested in, and I confess not having read the book, what you might have to say on the idea of power and how it might relate to its environment, whether it's contingent, how it relates to strength. It's an interesting topic. You must have given it a great deal of thought.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. I guess I was interested in when Trump was elected for the first time. I can't count the number of times I heard some talking head say, we don't need to worry too much because there will be adults in the room and they will curb the worst of his impulses. And what we saw very quickly was that they were the adults in the room were either kicked out or they left of their own volition because they couldn't stand it, or they decided, you know what, I don't mind being on this train. This will take me places that I want to go. And when I said that I was interested in this book and writing about the people around the two black holes of the brother and sister, I was interested to a large degree in the people who make decisions to say, I know who this person is. I know what they want and what they're going to do. And I'm going to hitch myself to that train. Like, I'm going to make the conscious decision to be part of whatever's coming. And there's power that corrupts, and then there's people who see that corruption is power. that's part of what appeals to them. You know, that serving a president who sees that there are checks and balances in place for a reason is one thing. Serving a president who believes there should be no checks and balances at all to their power opens up a lot of opportunities for people. And those people, I think, are a danger to everybody around them. And I think that's the world we're moving into. We're moving into the possibility of something like a global kleptocracy, you know, where Russia is the model. That's what Trump wants in America. I think that's what Erdogan wants in Turkey. I think that's what we're seeing in Hungary. I think to a certain degree in Israel we're seeing that. And I think the list is endless. Brazil was going down that road. And what the second election of Trump means is that the people who want the world to look like that will get comfort and aid from the most powerful country in the world. And that's a very, very frightening prospect to me. And I really don't know what the future holds. You know, the basketball term, jump ball, I think that's where we are. Like that, but the ball goes up and there's two sides that jump for it. And I couldn't say which side will land with it, which is not a very cheerful thought. But I do think that we're in that moment, you know, and the people in this novel are in that moment. And I keep thinking of that Dermot Healy novel, Sudden Times. We're in sudden times, and things will likely change very quickly for us in the next little while. And I'm not sure what those changes will look like.
But that's why we need novelists and artists to help us make sense of it. And it's why so many people are here on a rainy Friday night in Dublin, where they could just as easily be down the pub.
That's right.
But they've come here to listen to you. So my thanks to a lovely, engaged audience and your super questions. Thank you to Michael for this marvellous novel. It's historical, it's dark, it's literary, and yet it is so accessible and compelling. And I'm just so thrilled I have a whole lot of reading now for the summer. Such light reading for the summer. Thank you very much, Michael.
It's my pleasure. Thank you all for coming.